An enduring apparatus from America's war on terror. The controversial US prison in Cuba has been holding people captive now for 2 decades, most without charge and in inhumane conditions. What will it finally take to close it down? I'm Maria Ramos, and today's Newsmaker is 20 years of Guantanamo Bay. As the United States reeled from the attacks of 9/11, Washington vowed retaliation. A key part of the U.S. response was opening a detention camp at a U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. It was soon filled with nearly 800 suspected militants. The George W. Bush administration called them hardened killers, but many detainees were never charged with a crime, and torture became routine, including waterboarding and force feeding. And in the years that followed, the facility became seen as a stain on America's reputation. So why is the prison still open? Well, it's proven politically impossible to shut down. Barack Obama signed an executive order to close Guantanamo Bay during his first week as president. But despite 2 terms in office, it never happened. And that was thanks largely to a Republican-controlled Congress, which said it would not jeopardize national security for a campaign promise. As Obama's presidency neared an end, he tried one last time.
For many years, it's been clear that the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay does not advance our national security. It undermines it. This is about closing a chapter in our history. It reflects the lessons that we've learned since 9/11. Lessons that need to guide our nation going forward.
And that plan, too, failed to materialize. And the man who was to come after Obama made it clear that he had no such intention. This was Donald Trump during his campaign to become the Republican nominee.
This morning, I watched President Obama talking about Gitmo, right? Guantanamo Bay, which, by the way, we are keeping open, And we're going to load it up with some bad dudes, believe me. We're going to load it up. But here's the thing I didn't understand. I heard this, but I didn't understand it. We spend $40 million a month on maintaining this place. Now think of it. $40 million a month. I think we have, what do we have left in there? Like 100 people or something? So we're spending $40 million. I would guarantee you that I could do it for a tiny fraction. I don't mean like 39. I mean like maybe 5, maybe 3, maybe like peanuts. Maybe in our deal with Cuba, we get them to take it over and and reimburse us because we're probably paying rent.
Well, 2 decades since it opened, there are still 39 men locked up. 2/3 of them haven't been formally charged. And critics say closing the camp is not only a moral obligation, but it would also save the US billions of dollars. And it would end the human rights violations that can serve as a rallying cry and recruitment tool for America's enemies and extremists abroad. Last February, the Biden administration said it intended to shut down the facility during its term. In July, the first detainee in years was freed. Abdul Latif Nasser was repatriated to Morocco. And that was 5 years after US officials determined that he posed no threat and recommended his release. But in December, it became apparent during a Senate hearing on closing the camp that hardly any progress was being made.
I'm disappointed that the President and Attorney General have yet to respond to my letters. And I'm disappointed the administration declined to send a witness to testify at today's hearing on how they're working to close Guantanamo.
The only path to ending injustice in the military commissions for the defendants, for the country, and above all, for the victims, is to bring these military commissions to as rapid a conclusion as possible. Notice I don't say as just a conclusion as possible. It is too late in the process for the current military commissions to do justice for anyone.
If it's too late for justice to be done for those wrongfully imprisoned, can this chapter at least be closed? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Philadelphia by Mark Fallon, and he was the director of the Criminal Investigative Task Force at Guantanamo Bay itself. He then wrote the book Unjustifiable Means about the US government's use of torture. He's now the interim executive director at the Centre for Ethics and the Rule of Law. In London, we have Andy Worthington, the co-founder of the Close Guantanamo campaign and the author of the Guantanamo Files. And completing our panel is Tracy Doig. She's the head of international advocacy and accountability at Freedom from Torture. Welcome to all of you. Mark, I want to go to you first. 20 years on and 3 US presidents later, why is Guantanamo Bay still open?
The answer is simple. It's torture. It's the state-sponsored policies of torture that the U.S. government enacted post 9/11 that have permeated every aspect of the conditions at Guantanamo and the other black sites in this Gulag archipelago of dark prisons and black sites that are a stain on the Constitution of the United States.
But does that just justify it still being open?
No, it's unjustifiable, and that's why at CERL, the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, we convened a working group of interdisciplinary experts from different backgrounds, including myself, former chief investigative for military commissions, former chief prosecutor for military commissions, Mo Davis, former convening authorities for military commissions, John Altenberg, Harvey Rishikoff, former learned defense counsel for military commissions, ethicists, international law experts. And we've been working since June, and we have developed 13 recommendations for the Biden administration and for Congress to shutter this terrible, horrible facility that is a symbol of torture, injustice, and oppression.
And I want to get to what Biden could do and wants to do with Guantanamo Bay. But first of all, we have to talk about the book behind you that you wrote, Unjustifiable Means, that you subtitle the inside story of how the CIA, Pentagon, and the US government conspire to torture. What were your main findings of what actually went on there?
Well, the torture policies which were enacted by the Bush administration, and President Bush sanctioned torture. President Obama gave it sanctuary with his policies of impunity. President Trump celebrated it, and thus far, President Biden is ignoring it. And post 9/11. The greatest threat to our national security was not from another wave of potential terrorist attacks. It's from the U.S. government policies of subjugation and cruelty as policy, particularly towards Muslims around the world. At the time of the September 11th attacks and the USS Cole attack, Al-Qaeda was about 500 strong. How many tens of thousands of violent extremists do we have now? Violent extremism has proliferated basically due to policies that further subjugate a disaffected populace. And so one of the things that we did in our recommendations is to try to bring suspected terrorists to justice, restore the rule of law, and move away from this failed experiment of Guantanamo because it is not in the best interest of our national security or global security.
And you say Biden is ignoring Guantanamo Bay. Have you given him your proposals?
It is released today. So effective today, President Biden and the Congress will have access. It is online at the CERL website. And these recommendations are well thought out. For months we've worked on this. We've had a lot of debates and a lot of discussions to try to come up with a way to restore the rule of law and preserve international human rights while bringing terrorists to justice for the families of those victims who perished on September 11th in the USS Cole attack.
And I want to go to Andy. You are a campaigner to close Guantanamo Bay. What sparked that desire? What was it?
Well, I think from the beginning it was obvious that something had gone wrong with the US legal system, that men were being held without any rights whatsoever as human beings at Guantanamo. Now, when you deprive someone of their liberty and you claim to respect the rule of law, it's a different matter if you're a dictatorship. If you claim to respect the rule of law, then you either charge somebody with a crime and put them on trial, and you do that as swiftly as possible, or you can hold them as prisoners of war protected by the Geneva Conventions. The men held at Guantanamo were neither. They were a novel category of prisoner, enemy combatants, essentially dreamt up by the Bush administration, who, just to reiterate, were held fundamentally without any rights whatsoever as human beings. It took years for the courts to grant them any kind of rights, and there have been various tussles that have been involved with lawyers and the courts. So that fundamentally, even to this day, the men that are still held at Guantanamo are held without rights. They're held at the whim of the President of the United States and of Congress, which is not supposed to happen in countries that respect the rule of law. There is, no obligation for any of the men that the US says it wants to put on trial to have to actually put on trial. And there is absolutely no mechanism whereby the other men held at Guantanamo can be released. It's astonishing that we're still stuck with this legal, ethical and moral abomination after 20 years.
Tracy, you advocate for human rights and to stop torture. Why is it still open? Is your work pushing through these barriers? Is anyone listening to you, Tracy?
I don't think that actually anyone is listening. I think that despite the efforts of countless campaigners and groups and individuals themselves who were detained at Guantanamo to speak out and share the atrocities of what goes on in that place, that actually it's convenient for the camp to remain open, for the system that continues to imprison them, because actually closing the camp and starting a process of accountability in trying to seek out and expose those who ordered the torture to be used, both in Guantanamo and in the dark sites across the globe, would be too politically uncomfortable for countless states across the world who, not only the US, but other governments like the UK and other countries in different parts of the world that cooperated with the US in renditions and in facilitating the transport of men to Guantanamo. So I think a true process of seeking justice and accountability would be politically uncomfortable for many countries.
Mark, I want to pick up on that point that Tracy made. It's convenient to keep Guantanamo Bay open.
Yeah, that's it. Tracy's exactly right. And that's why what we have to do is make it more painful to keep it open than it would be to close it. It is complex. It's a complex issue to close it, but it is possible. What we have to first do is illuminate the darkness on torture. We have to admit that we tortured. We have to lift this cloak of invisibility that the government places over anything that would show or shine a light on torture of their torturers. And in doing so, we will then be able to get people. There's people at Guantanamo in indefinite detention without trial. It is not because of what they did to us. It is because of what we've done to them and the fear that they will talk about what happened. Their memories are classified. Anything that I write to publish has to go through a pre-publication review process and is subject to government censorship and redaction. I have a case now. We have a writ of certiorari before the Supreme Court challenging that process. And so while Tracy's right that the world is ignoring these 39 human beings in some stage of the rest of their lives at Guantanamo, it's time for the American public and the world to stand up and say, we will no longer do this. To Joe Biden, I say, come on, man, do your job. Appoint someone in charge of closing Guantanamo. The problem right now is no one's in charge of that. He needs to appoint the Secretary of Defense to be in charge of that and say, within a year, I want to shutter that prison. I want suspected terrorists brought to justice under the rule of law in a legitimate process, and then we need to move on from there.
Mark, you say, the US has to admit it tortures, and that would expose everything that has happened in these 20 years. That question to you, Andy, if everything is revealed, what does this do then to America's image, its moral compass, its reputation internationally, if everything that has happened in Guantanamo Bay over 20 years comes out?
I would say that an extraordinary amount has been revealed through an endless amount of reporting and of first-hand testimony by former prisoners, by the Senate Intelligence Committee's torture report released in 2014. We only got the executive summary, and it was redacted, but it was an absolutely damning document about what took place. I think the problem with Guantanamo, the most intractable issue, is that the men who went through the CIA black site program, who were explicitly tortured in sites that were set up in other countries cynically by the Bush administration, by the CIA, there is an absolute commitment on the part of the CIA to try to keep as much of that story hidden, to try and make sure that nobody is held accountable. Now, no one who has been through any of this process over the last 20 years has avoided torture. But the forever prisoners at Guantanamo, the ones who are not charged with crimes, the story of why they are held is something that is absolutely inexplicable on this day, the 20th anniversary. We have 15 men now who have been approved for release by high-level US government review processes, and yet Joe Biden is sitting on his hands and doing nothing about freeing them. There are men held there who could be sent back to their homes in Pakistan this afternoon, if that's what President Biden decided was required. There's a man from Algeria who's been waiting 5 years. Some of the men need third countries to be found for their resettlement, but there are things that he could absolutely do right now, and we need to see those done. We need to see these men released.
And Tracy, you say, it is convenient. That was the point you made. Andy says, of course, many people could be, just released this afternoon, today. What are the main obstacles that you see, Tracy?
I think that the excuses that are used are some of those that Andy outlines around seeking third states, etc. But the point that Mark has made and Andy has made is, I think, the key point, that what transpired in the processes that led to the men being detained, not only at Guantanamo, but through the dark sites, means that there is information about intelligence processes that states would still be wanting to use in ongoing operations or intelligence investigations, that perhaps they don't want to admit what processes they've been using or how they came to those processes in front of a transparent process that has oversight from legislatives. And I think, I'm surmising here, but I think that what the intelligence and military processes have learned from Guantanamo have been useful to them. And the continued detention of 39 men is the price that they're willing to pay for that information and for that intelligence.
Okay, and I understand. Mark, do those 39 men pose a threat? And did the ones that were there before, did they even pose a threat?
Well, we had almost 800 people at Guantanamo. If you return some to their villages in an area that's besieged by war, you may be able to claim that a small percentage, have returned to the battlefield. But these, for the most part, these weren't battlefield captures to start with. These were, as we call them, bounty babies. These were people that we pay bounty for. They were kidnapped and sent to Guantanamo. There are some people at Guantanamo who I believe should be brought to a judicial process and let a legitimate judicial process decide whether they are guilty of the crimes and whether what happened to them might mitigate any type of penalties, or at least be considered in that process. Most of the people at Guantanamo, there's no legitimate threat that they pose to the United States. Most of them have been in custody almost 20 years. They have no networks. They have very little skills. Any type of fear-mongering that if we release one of them to Saudi Arabia, that they'd somehow be able to pilot a jet into a building in the United States is absolutely ludicrous. But that is what people try to do to instill fear about these human beings that are remaining at Guantanamo. Again, as Andy has illustrated, some have been cleared for release, and many others are just there in indefinite detention without trial. They've been taken from their countries and they've been placed on this Azkaban-like prison, this offshore prison that's this legal limbo that they're kind of untouchable. And we have to make sure that the world understands their cause, because this time it's them, next time it might be you.
So just to be very clear, Mark, 39 prisoners that are still there pose no threat to the United States.
I doubt that many there would pose any threat to the United States if you release them right now to the world.
So the question, going to you now, Andy, has Guantanamo Bay over the past 20 years made the US any safer?
No, absolutely not. It's just inflamed tensions throughout the Muslim world, because this is a prison that has only held Muslims. It holds Muslims in circumstances that would be absolutely unacceptable for US citizens. It is absolutely unthinkable that the process of indefinite detention without charge or trial could exist on the US mainland. So no, I mean, it has done nothing to protect anyone. The only way that you can protect yourself from any kind of terrorist threat is that you stick to your values. We've heard this throughout the years from various US presidents who have mouthed the words about the necessity that, when you're tested the most by something like 9/11, that's when you find out whether your values mean anything, because you have to uphold them. But the United States didn't. And we haven't seen this situation brought to a definitive end, and nor will we until Guantanamo is closed, and until the United States government, now and in future, promises that they will never again become engaged in a program, a global program of kidnap, rendition, and torture, and creating a facility where the United States government holds people indefinitely without charge or trial. That is the behavior of a dictatorship. It's not the behavior of a country that claims to respect the rule of law.
Tracy, we don't have long to go on the show, but do you think that you will ever see Guantanamo Bay closed?
I would certainly hope so. And I think that organizations and individuals around the globe will do their very best to ensure that that happens. I think a key part of that is the mobilizing force of the voices of the men who survived that place and the systems. That's something that the torture survivors that we work with at Freedom from Torture are very clear about, that survivors have to be empowered to speak out themselves. And we've seen that happen, and we would like to see that to continue to happen. But I do think that it is possible through mobilization of people piercing through the consciousness of the American public, the British public, and those who interested citizens around the world who would like to see real justice done, not the facade of justice that Guantanamo offers.
Mark, final thoughts from you. Do you think we'll see Guantanamo Bay closed? And can those your proposals that you're going to give President Biden actually, get us there?
They can get past that. What we need to do is we need a special envoy in the State Department recreated. We need the Secretary of Defense to be told that within a year, you will shutter that facility. We need to utilize videotape for plea agreements. We have to take the death penalty off the table. We have to ensure that we eliminate any evidence as fruit of the poisonous tree for torture or abusive practices. And then we have to let a judicial process. If we were to do this again, we would use courts-martial. right, if we got in a situation like this. So whatever cannot be resolved by a plea agreement within a year, then we need to revert to another process, either a federal court or to a legitimate process, judicial process, with real transparency and scrutiny. Right now, defense counsel don't even get access to material that they are cleared for. And so once we lift this cloak of invisibility over torture and abuse, we could then have a legitimate argument, and we can, should, and must close Guantanamo Bay.
And on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, to Mark Fallon, Andy Worthington, and Tracy Doig. Thank you so much, all of you. And to our audience, thanks for watching. And you can follow us on Twitter at _the Newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Maria Ramos. See you next time. And thanks for your company. Bye-bye.